In late January, Richmond was buried in one of the biggest snowstorms on record. It was Sunday night around 10 o'clock, and I hear this loud knock at my door. And I said, oh no, can I ignore this, pretend like I'm not home? And then I remembered my entire life is devoted to the big idea that we as a community belong together, that maybe a place could bring us closer, a bridge could connect us, a park could be a place to see a neighbor you knew, you didn't know, should know, wanted to know. And I realized pretty quickly I needed to answer the door. And I did, and there was a young guy there, and he pointed to the snow shovel that was sitting on my front porch, and he said, hey man, can I borrow that snow shovel? My girlfriend has to go to work the next day. I said, sure. He said he'd return in a couple hours. The next morning, the snow was starting to pile up pretty high, as you probably remember, and I was none too happy to look outside and find no snow shovel. So I did the reverse. I knocked on my neighbor's door and I said, hey man, can I borrow your snow shovel? And I went out and shoveled for hours, and eventually my new neighbor next door to me came and joined me, and she and I and her daughter and shoveling became fast friends. This hard labor was critical for neighborhood bonding. And I tell this story because the idea of neighbors and neighborliness has become a touchstone for a project I've been privileged to work on called BridgePark. Inspired by the High Line in New York, BridgePark is a long-term vision to create a unique public gathering space, a linear park that crosses the James River. It brings more people the beauty of the James River, connects neighborhoods, and creates an entirely new way for us to engage with one another and connect with one another. And in thinking about the project, I think a lot about this word neighbor. And whenever I was growing up, my father, when we had a question about a word, my father would always say, get your dictionary. And I still don't understand why he pronounces the word that way, but he does. And so, lesson learned nonetheless, I did. And Dad, in 2016, it's the Urban Dictionary. And the Urban Dictionary says neighbor, a convenient person to have as a friend, as they live near you. Dude, let's chill. We live close. We're neighbors. It'll be easy. Now, in many neighborhoods, like the folks whose homes are literally attached to mine, that is indeed the case. However, unfortunately, many of my neighbors were systematically separated from me. Civic projects in Richmond and throughout the country were designed with the express purpose of frustrating this big idea that we live close, so we should chill. One of the many places this happened in Richmond, Virginia, is on the Manchester Bridge or 9th Street downtown. Built at a time of white flight, its sole goal was to get people the heck out of the city as quickly as possible. As a result, one of the most beautiful stretches of our city has the breadth of a major highway, creating an effective barrier to connection and engagement. In 2016, we want to enjoy our cities. We want to enjoy each other. Community is a strong orienting word for us, and it's time our city's infrastructure reflected that. So as you can imagine, as the steward of this project, I had a weighty responsibility. I knew nothing about developing a park, but I knew first and foremost that the park's process must match the sincerity of the park's purpose. That neighborliness was not just a goal of the park, but it was the vehicle to make it happen. And one of the first things we did was we adopted our first core value, which was that BridgePark was not just a park for the community, but that it would be a park by the community. And I went out into the community to learn. And a funny thing happened. These encounters, these engagements that we hope to have on BridgePark one day started happening to me every day. Several years ago, I was set to meet with a local leader for coffee, and I showed up, and there were actually two people sitting at our two-person table, and unbeknownst to me, she had invited a local pastor to join us who had written a book that I had just finished reading about the evolution of our city. And during our conversation, at one point, he went over and grabbed a napkin from the barista, and he drew this picture, and he said, Ted, what if your linear park were not just a line, but a circle? What is important in that area? How can you have a bigger impact throughout this circle? And we really attacked that challenge in a few different ways, and I think these lessons that I've learned are sort of universal, and I hope you can apply them to something you may be working on. So I've been known to have a party or two at my house. And when you have a party, right, it's common courtesy to notify, or depending on the nature of the party, warn your neighbors that this is happening. And so what do? You go knock on their doors, and hopefully at a reasonable hour of the night. And what do, right? You don't tell them you're having a party. You ask them if they will come. That's what we did with hundreds of neighbors throughout the city. We went to them and we didn't tell them we're going to build a BridgePark and it's going to look like this and we hope you like it. We asked them, what do you think? What would you do? What is your vision for this idea? We even left these little what-if cards all around town asking, what would you do there? What do you like about the idea? What do you dislike? What's your vision? What's your dream? You know, it turned out that the most important people to ask were people I was told not to ask. And whenever I was told that somebody was trouble or they're in the minority, it doesn't matter necessarily what they think, they have strong ideas, I always knew that was my next meeting. And it's these people on whom, throughout this process, from whom I've learned the most and on whom I lean the most. As with any endeavor, you don't really grow that much by engaging people who agree with you. A great example of this fact was the local climbing community. Now, one of the coolest things about the BridgePark site is the active climbing on these beautiful old piers. And when I first started working, not in an outdoor climbing gym, by the way, on an 1838 ruin in the middle of a river, in the middle of downtown. How cool is that? And when I first started working on this project, there was a drawing that showed a bridge deck sitting on top of these piers. And as a result, the climbing community was identified as a group to avoid. And so I went straight to them. This is my friend Rob. He has extreme taste in outdoor sports, and as you can tell, pants. And when I approached Rob about BridgePark, he didn't tell me my idea sucked. He asked me to join he and his friends for beers. And that's what we did for several hours, and we talked and had a wonderful time together, eventually walking over to the site of the climbing walls where we talked about history and climbing and each other and just began to grow together. And as the sun set, Jamie looked at me and he said, Ted, you know, this is a cool project, and you know, is there any way that you can keep a couple of these piers exposed for climbing? And I told him I would do the best that I could, and he said, you know what, thanks for asking. I didn't think anybody would care what I think about this project or that anything I had to say would have an impact. And the truth was, what he had to say transformed the project. On a later visit of the site, we identified this Osprey Nest sitting on top of one of the piers, and actually in the video version of this drone shot, the osprey actually gets up and flies away in this Disney moment, and as if to say, hey, I'm down here too, thanks for checking. And we realized that within this circle, our user group was not just humans, but some of the most spectacular and vital urban nature anywhere. Eventually, we were lucky enough to hire a spectacular design team with a resume you can hardly imagine. And you know what? We did the same thing again. We didn't tell them to build a BridgePark that looked like this, to design this thing with these features in this location. We asked them, what would you do? What is your vision for this idea? Here's what we've heard from the community. What are your thoughts? And their excellence and intellect has carried us to places far beyond our own imaginations could. And as part of that process, one of the wonderful things that's happened in what we called an ideas study, again, we weren't building a BridgePark, we were building ideas, is this beautiful model of the park site. It's 14 feet long and 4 feet wide, and it's been used to engage ideas and to engage people. And all of a sudden, the talking with the community became making with the community. We used these tiny pieces of wood to test different BridgeParks and designs and features. And there would be a time where a community leader would suggest a design feature, and I would look in the corner and one of the architects would be whittling it. And it was amazing how this process was happening. And like an artist process, we succeeded and failed. But what I was learning was that sort of this next lesson is long before you start making something, just start making. And we did. And like an artist, we succeeded and failed, and we took pieces of failures and attached them to successes until we started to truly unlock something hugely powerful and significant for our city. But the most important part of this process was that together we were seeing that by moving these puzzle pieces, we could change our city. And those divisive projects that were done years ago, you know what? They were done by people, and thus must be undone by people. And we realized that a small group could create division, a large group could certainly create connection. The next thing we did was we took the BridgePark model on the road and this to neighborhoods throughout the city, and this is a picture of it at 1708 Gallery in the downtown arts district. This process was multiplying our impact in a huge way. Instead of dictating and letting go, we were building a much bigger project. And as you can imagine, when we first started talking about, we're gonna build a world-class park across an urban river, a lot of people said, that's too bold for this city. That's a pretty dream. And so we took the suggestion that it was too bold, and we made it bolder. We weren't going to just build a bridge park. We were going to take on this idea of a divided city. And you know what? This problem of an overbuilt bridge was also our solution. We would flip its script. A place designed to quickly escape from the city would be a place to slowly enjoy the city. A place designed to separate us would be redesigned as a place to gather us together. And I went to the climbing community, and they said, hey, they came back to check in and said, is there any way you guys were able to leave a couple of those piers exposed for climbing? And I told them we were leaving all of the piers exposed for climbing. The folks who had suggested that we somehow connect the park to the Manchester Bridge and to the city center, I told them that the Bridge Park would be on the Manchester Bridge and in the city center. A number of folks had talked about this sort of derelict park nearby the site and said, what could you do there? And we said, well, what if we connected the two parks, connected this park to the river and to the Bridge Park, and this mess of concrete instead looked something like this? At which point, having made these connections, we started to think, well, what else is in this circle? What destinations, what neighborhoods could we gather within this area? And all these beautiful things were nearby, and we started to determine that we were going to need a bigger napkin. Even the dreamy what-if cards started to make their way into our architect's drawings, and suggestions of an urban ecology center, a public art wall, a performance space could all take place here. Suddenly, we had unlocked a completely novel thing. We could create a space. We could turn not only a bridge into a park, but parks to bridges. Parks that could connect us to people and ideas and to neighborhoods. And something cool to have started to feel like something critical to have. And folks who once said, oh, it would be cool to do that, now said, well, we must do that. So by listening to the community, imagining with the community, and building with the community, we are building a better project. And we have a really long ways to go, but I believe by doing these things that we now have a project so important to the evolution of our city that it may be, yes, too big to let fail. And so at this point, you may remember the story from the beginning and say, okay, Ted, I see how being a good neighbor is building you a better bridge park. But what about the dude who stole your snow shovel? That was messed up. A couple weeks ago on a warm summer evening, I got home from a night out, and on my front porch was sitting the snow shovel. Taped to the side of the snow shovel was this envelope. It says on the cover, neighbors. I tore it open, and $20 fell out. And this letter, it says, Dear neighbor, I just found out today that my roommate did not return the snow shovel that I borrowed during the snowstorm. I have yelled at my roommate. And I do not know how to set things right. I had told her to return it later that night, but clearly that did not happen. I'm at a loss on how to make this better, since I have never forgotten to return something borrowed. Next snowstorm, I will shovel your walkway and porch. Awesome. I have also attached a little bit of money. I know money is probably not important for this. However, I cannot think of what else to do. Please do not hate us. I sincerely apologize for not returning the shovel. Your neighbors, Alex and Morgan. After being so annoyed at this person, I now had 2 snow shovels, a bunch of new friends, a less sore back next time it snows, and $20. Months later, this simple neighborly act multiplied into all these gifts. Thank you very much.